The demonic dragon Shidou Ryusei versus the demonic monster Bachira Meguru. A fight that has been getting the community into a frenzy lately, especially after the final salaries were revealed. And so in today's video, we are going to look at each player's stats, abilities, and explore their best feats to determine who is the best freak show of Blue Lock. Shidou Ryusei. Few words could describe this abomination of a character. A very aggressive and egotistical player, but also a very skilled striker that can't simply be explained by pure logic. Because to Shidou, playing football, or specifically scoring, is the very act of living. And this is completely in line with Shidou being a genius, which actually is the name of the game in today's video, as these two are the easiest to identify geniuses among the Blue Lockers, because everything they do is completely instinctive and lack any thought process behind it. As for Shidou, all of his abilities and weapons, all of his existence is just so he can achieve the explosion of life, or in normal human terms, score a goal. But, and because I always get carried out, first let's actually start with his physical stats, which while not broken by any means, when we look at Shidou he actually houses an amazing physicality. I mean, for someone as skinny as he is, he packs quite the punch and is surprisingly strong. Hey, maybe all that fighting means something at the end. But it's not just his strength, as you see his speed is also demonic. He's not quite Chigiri or Zantetsu, but I would say he is on Otoya and Yuki's level, which is definitely insane, and actually means more for Shidou due to his playing style, which we'll get to in a second. However, next, and now that the PXG game is over, I can finally say with confidence that he has an insane endurance, because he was one of the few players who were doing a lot of things the whole game, and not really ran out of gas like other players. Next, for his jumping ability, I'd say he is crazy good in the air. And what I found really great about him is not how high he can jump. Even though he has crazy jumps, I'd say what he can do in the air is the most impressive thing about him. We saw him pull out some of the craziest stunts in the air, and is in fact, in addition to Kunigami and Baro, the only players with a header goal, and Shidou actually has two. However, I gotta say that this is not entirely due to his jumping ability, and actually is also due to the best aspect to his physicality, which is of course his insane agility. But for us to really explore this aspect, we need to talk about his abilities and weapons, as this agility really shines there because it is at the center of his explosive existence. Now, let's start from the top. Most, if not all of Shidou's weapons exist only for him to score when he is in the penalty box. But I feel like the first weapon we gotta talk about is the one that actually allows him to reach the penalty box in the first place. There is of course his off-the-ball movements, which unlike other players with great off-the-ball movements, Shidou's are actually completely instinctive. No logic behind them, no time wasted thinking, and no interval between his plays. One moment he is here, but as soon as the play changes, he is already on the move, which for the longest time allowed Shidou to actually be the fastest to react. That was until Isigi unlocks the fastest piece, and of course I'm excluding the pros here. As you see, even speedsters like Chigiri and Yuki get thrown off very easily by Shidou's instinctive off-the-ball movements. And this is because while other players need time to think and react to the play, by the time they do that, Shidou is already on the move. And in a sense, this actually allowed Shidou to link up with any pass regardless of quality. We've seen even loose balls are potential goals when Shidou is on the pitch. But that's only one way to look at it. The fact that almost anyone can get thrown off by his off-the-ball movements means that Shidou is a very slippery striker. He can shake off almost any player or defender simply because his plays are instinctive. And when you couple this with his insane speed, it becomes very hard to defend against Shidou. Unless it is man marking, which honestly for the most part was one of his biggest shortcomings. The way Kunigami handled him in the PXG game was really embarrassing. However, I want you to put a pin on that because I will be getting back to it later. For now, let's carry on with his instinctive off-the-ball movements and what they enable him to do. As you see, we can say with confidence that they are on metavision level, but because they are entirely instinctive, they are definitely on the highest level of metavision. In fact, you can think of them as if Shidou has metavision without actually having metavision. Shidou has Isagi's off-the-ball movements without actually relying on noticing the opponent's eyes before making a move. And the reason for this difference is of course him being a genius and the rest of the metavision users all being talented learners. And as I said before, in order to actually beat Shidou to the ball, Isigi had to evolve the fastest piece weapon. And even after that, Shidou was right behind him, being the second who reacted to Ness's pass. And actually this duality with metavision allows him to very easily connect with its users. In fact, his best performance is usually coupled with metavision midfielders. And if you think about it, this alone is actually very insane. It means that when it comes to reading the field and actually perfect positioning himself, Shidou always was on Kaiser and Isigi's level. And I find it very interesting that he is doing all of that effortlessly, especially after knowing what it takes for the talented learners in order to achieve metavision. And just to put things into perspective, I think Isigi became another player when he unlocked metavision. Isigi prior to this weapon was definitely a good striker, however after unlocking metavision, he became the man who was able to reach the #1 spot, and Shidou rivaling him in this point specifically is definitely one of the greatest feats he has. However, and as I said, this weapon serves the purpose of enabling Shidou to reach the penalty box. And there, once he does, his agility comes to play. As you see, when we couple it with his insane instincts, he can launch himself to the ball before almost anyone. And the fact that he is scary fast and he can jump really high should put into perspective just how threatening Shidou is in the penalty box. And what's scarier is that it actually doesn't end with this, as more impressively with his agility, it allows him to shoot in almost any situation, even with his back turned to the goal. And while his shooting is not as accurate as for example Baro or Rin, he actually packs quite the powerful shots. And when you look at his playing style, you don't really need that much accuracy if you are that close to the goal. However, and again, the most impressive thing to his shots is actually his conditioning, where Shidou can shoot from almost any situation. Which means through all of this, you get a player that can fetch and turn almost any pass into a goal. Hell, even an intercepted ball in the penalty box can be snatched and turned into a goal by Shidou. And if I am not making it clear, it means that Shidou is a very slippery striker who has an instinctive ability to be one of the best scorers in the show. In fact, it took a powerhouse like Kunigami in order to stop the demon from being so deadly. And this leads us back to the point of Kunigami man-marking him. As you see, before I really thought this is a weakness of Shidou. To be rendered completely useless after getting man-marked by physically capable players is really a detriment to any playing style. And honestly, for the longest part, I really hated this about Shidou. Like, it seemed that this is his kryptonite. First it was Ryo, and later and even far more impressively was Kunigami. However, at the end of the PXG game, we know that keeping Shidou tame for a whole game with just one player is simply impossible, as Kunigami just ran out of gas mid-game, which honestly is a scary thing for his team. And even still, even when he caught his breath and came back, he was unable to keep Shidou on a leash. And that actually happened for 3 reasons. First, and as I just said, Kunigami running out of gas. But secondly, much how Ryo realized, due to Shidou's agility and his instinctive plays, it is actually very hard to defend against everything he throws, especially when coupled with an insane midfielder like Charles or Sai, as Shidou is just bound to find a way at some point. Thirdly, however, and more importantly, Shidou was actually able to adapt to Kunigami. In chapter 290, after getting brutally tackled by the orange muscle head, Shidou, expecting that, was quick to get back on his feet, not giving the tired Kunigami any time to actually keep up the marking, which left poor Kiora alone to actually deal with the demon. And had it not been for Rin, Shidou would have actually ended the game then and there. And by the way, I know it's not a video about him, but this puts into perspective how crazy Lorenzo's durability is. To be able to keep Kaiser on a leash for the entirety of the game is honestly one of the greatest feats in the entirety of Blue Lock. However, let's get back to Shidou, who overall I would say he is one of the most threatening, one of the deadliest strikers in Blue Lock, and definitely worthy of the label Demonic Dragon. However, can he beat the monstrous beast? Bachira Meguru, the unlimited monster dribbler of Blue Lock. A very light-hearted character that is easygoing and friendly. and almost seems to be too reliant on others. On the pitch, however, Bachira is the true definition of freedom. As you see, he only goes for plays that excite his heart and push his imagination boundaries, whether be it with his dribbles or with his passes. He only lives for the new horizons he can uncover. However, and as always, let's start with his physicality. And for Bachira, I would say he is another Isigi. Simply put, another average Joe. Other than his endurance, honestly, there is nothing to be said about his physicality. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's actually move on to where he really shines, his abilities and weapons. First of all, I gotta say that Bachira only has 2 weapons, and the more important one of the 2 is actually a compound weapon that compiles a lot of other small weapons and techniques. And so let's start with the simpler one, which is of course his passing ability. You see, I've always said that the PXG game is my favorite due to the explanation of the types of ego. And after what Ego said about geniuses being very hard to get understood by the rest of the world, it becomes very easy why Bachira had that rough childhood. He simply was misunderstood by his peers and ended up being very lonely. As such, him wanting to have a monster to play football with pushed him to be more of a midfielder for other strikers like Isigi and Rin in the early stages of Blue Lock. And in that role, he definitely had some of the greatest passes. In fact, much like Chigiri, this is an ability that he carried on even when he became a full-fledged striker. As in the Manshine City game, we saw him deliver one of the best passes in the entirety of Blue Lock. And so, just know that when needs be, Bachira could work as a great midfielder. And in fact, his secondary weapon, which makes him a great striker, also could help him in the midfielder role. And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about the core of Bachira's playing style, his dribbling ability. As you see, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Bachira is one of, if not the best dribbler in the U20 category right now. And this is saying something when we have beasts like Sai, Lorenzo and Chigiri. And the reason I am saying he might have the best dribbling ability is the fact that he beats both Chigiri and Lorenzo, who are at 93 while Bachira is at 95. And what makes his dribbling so deadly is just how open and unlimited it is. You see, while playing, Bachira imagines a monster who leads his thoughts towards new heights and new dribbling moves, which means that Bachira's dribbling is only restricted by his imagination and is in fact the true personification of his ultimate ego. And I gotta say something here, there isn't a player that screams freedom type of ego much like Bachira. It's just written all over his playing style. In fact, the only time when he was restricted by both Rin and Isigi, he definitely was struggling, and as soon as he dropped that, we've seen him being able to dribble even past a pro, which by the way is still one of the craziest feats ever. However, let's actually explore this dribbling ability of his. Now, Bachira's whole existence is to pierce through with absolute craziness that speaks true to his freedom. As such, he uses random dribbling moves that are simply beyond everyone's imagination. And sometimes his dribbling moves are actually very deadly and very hard to even comprehend. In fact, the more the player is knowledgeable about football and the more the player is logical, the more he gets destroyed by this dribbling ability. And as I said, Bachira was able to even take a pro by surprise through his dribbling, which just should tell you how crazy Bachira is dribbling and why it is the definition of unorthodoxy. And I feel like whenever I speak about Bachira, I always have to bring this feat up, which is him going one-on-one against Aiku. You see, Aiku's analytical eye allows him to be very deadly against strikers and especially dribblers, as he is capable of calculating the best route that the dribbler should take, and thus he can easily counter them. However, because Bachira is the definition of unorthodoxy, he was able to take Aiko's analytical eye and completely violate it with an insane set of dribbling moves, to the point Aiko was just like, what the hell is even going on? And that's all due to his analytical eye that Bachira simply violated. And mind you, these two insane feats were all before he trained under Levi, who quite literally opened Bachira's horizons to a new height, a new dimension, and a new level of operation. And by the way, what I love about their dynamics, Levi actually did not teach Bachira any new rhythms or moves, but rather, as I just said, he took his technicality to the next level. Through the Ginga, which is better summarized as a Brazilian dribbling style, where the player keeps his upper body as steady as possible while unleashing his craziness with his footwork to make it even harder to read his moves. With this new technique, Bachira now feels as an unlimited beast with infinite options when dealing with the defensive line. And just to put into perspective how insane this is, Lorenzo's dribbling ability is just broken simply due to his wobbly body. It is near impossible to read Lorenzo because his center of gravity is all messed messed up. And Bachira through the Ginga is kinda achieving that. His center of gravity is completely detached from his footwork, which means good luck for any defender trying to read Bachira one-on-one. I say one-on-one because I feel the biggest limiting factor to his dribbling ability is actually his rhythms. You see, even though he is the monster of freedom and unlimited thinking and dribbling moves, there is still some beauty to his chaos, a beauty that players like Ness and Cavazos were able to exploit, telling him that he can't win by employing the same rhythm. You see, while you cannot expect what Bachira is about to do one-on-one, overall and the way he moves throughout the field is actually very predictable, or at least it was at the start of the Neo-Egoist League. But by the end of the arc, Bachira might have adapted varying rhythms to his dribbling ability. As in the Menshine City game, his dribbling sometimes feels a bit more aggressive than other times, and this could mean that he might now present different rhythms. However, we actually do not know this for sure, and I really need to see more of him in order to confirm this. But as it stands, I think he is on the right track to alleviate his biggest shortcoming and truly reaching his full potential, to be the beast of unlimited options and a true freedom monster. But can this monstrous beast beat the demon of Blue Lock? For how this matchup would go, I gotta start by saying that this matchup is needlessly controversial. For some reason, a lot of players underestimate a certain player and kinda overestimate a feat of another player. And I truly believe that there is a lot of recency bias in the community regarding this subject. As you see, despite me being completely against Shidou's salary, I still think he is one of the greatest strikers in Blue Lock. And I feel like this is definitely something that the community is getting wrong. Simply saying that Shidou does not deserve a higher salary than Baro does not mean that Baro is necessarily better. I feel like for how much Baro contributed to Ubers, he definitely deserves a higher salary. As for why he is better or worse than Shidou, we need to look at the individual feats. And this is the exact same fallacy between Bachira and Shidou. You see, I am one of those who believe that Bachira's salary should have been higher than Shidou's, simply because Bachira was carrying his team single-handedly, and thus I believe he is more valuable to FC Barca than for example Shidou is to PXG. However, this does not mean I truly believe that Bachira is better than Shidou. And as I said, this is the fallacy that I feel the community is falling into. Just because Bachira performed amazing in his last game does not mean he is better than Shidou. Sure, Bachira destroyed the whole team with his dribbling, but do I need to remind you that this is Menshine? This is the same team that Kazu did this to them. This is the same team that Isigi did this to them. In fact, Isigi was so oppressive against them, he was winning while fighting two of his teammates. And it's not even about what Isigi and Kaiser can do to Menshine, even Yuki was able to dribble past all of them. And had it not been again for Chris Prince, he would have scored. And here where things get dicey. Even though I think Bachira's feat of dribbling past an entire team is still very impressive, I don't think it is as impressive as doing it against Bastard Munich, PXG and Ubers. And so when dealing with Bachira vs Shidou, I want you guys to keep this one in mind. And I know Bachira was able to dribble even past the entirety of Bastard with the help of Lara and Otoya. However, you have to put into perspective that that was before Isigi got metavision, and the second time he tried that, he was stopped by Ness of all people. And I know Ness is an insane player, but he is not insane on defense. Even Baro, who is not considered to be as good of a dribbler as Bachira or Yuki, was able to destroy Ness on multiple occasions as well. And I feel this is all due to Bachira's rhythms being the same, and the enemy team's ability to actually stop him in his tracks once they witness his dribbling ability. When we move to Shidou, however, I think things get a bit interesting. First of all, his best feat is without a doubt his goal against Bastard Munich, and I want you guys to think about it this way. In order to beat Ubers, who were rallied behind Baro, Isigi had to come up with this no connection play just in order to beat Aiko and Baro. However, in the next game, Charles and Shidou were able to effortlessly replicate said goal. And here's the kicker, sure Uber's defense is better. However, Shidou did it while Kaiser, Isigi and Hiyori were all next to him, yet no one was able to keep up with him. And I know a lot of thanks should go to Charles, but still, this is an insane stunt from Shidou. And in fact, he was so threatening that Noah had to put Kunigami on him just to man-mark him, utilizing Kunigami's fire to get his revenge. And even still, he was not capable of doing it for the entirety of the game. At the end of the PXG match, it really felt as if Shidou completely regained his freedom. And as I said, had it not been for Rin's stubbornness, Shidou would have definitely scored then and there. And I know it was thanks to Rin that Shidou was able to pull off that whole play, and I can definitely see Bachira dribbling past Kiora and Kunigami with no issue. However, you have to remember that Charles only passed there because Shidou perfectly positioned himself in a counter position to Ren. And here I really feel like we're reaching a point where both are deadly in their own ways. And so much like was the case with Shidou versus Baro, we need to look at who is more consistent. And in all honesty, I really feel Shidou is more consistent. As I said, even with Bastard Munich having insane metavision users on defense, Shidou still managed to be one hell of a threat. And until Bachira fixes his rhythm problems, I don't think he is as consistent as Shidou. And in fact, there is another angle to look at this. Even if you think Bachira is slightly better than Shidou on offense, there is the whole thing with Shidou on defense. Due to his instinctive off-the-ball plays, Shidou is actually one of the great striker defenders, rivaling even Rin, Isigi and Kaiser. And this is where things get really bad for Bachira, as the latter simply can't stand up to Shidou in this point. And so overall, I really say Shidou is definitely better, and he is the winner of today's video and the one walking with a W. However, that's all I've got for you today guys. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, thank you for watching.